What if I told you that in medieval times, newlyweds would often have their bed sheets inspected by the entire village the morning after their wedding night? What if you discovered that medieval people had surprisingly frank attitudes about certain bodily functions, yet lived in crushing fear of eternal damnation for the slightest moral misstep? Tonight we're going to explore the complex, contradictory, and often shocking world of medieval sexuality, morality, and daily shame that defined life for millions of people across Europe for nearly 1,000 years. Welcome back to Boring History to Sleep, where we explore the forgotten corners of human experience that textbooks often skip over. Before we begin our journey tonight, I'm curious, where are you checking in from, and what time is it there? Whether you're settling in for the night in New York, or perhaps starting your morning somewhere across the globe, you're part of our growing community of history enthusiasts who find peace in the stories of those who came before us. If you truly enjoy these explorations into the quieter, more intimate aspects of history, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to join our community. And don't forget to let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like us to explore next. Or simply check in and let us know how you're doing. Your engagement and suggestions help shape these journeys we take together, and your continued support means everything. Now, you might want to turn those lights down, maybe put a fan on for some gentle background noise, and settle in as we travel back nearly 800 years to experience what life was really like for the vast majority of medieval Europeans. Tonight's exploration will take us through 4 distinct aspects of medieval life, beginning with the harsh realities faced by common people, then moving through the stories of those who shaped this world, the mysteries that still puzzle historians today, and finally, the stark contrasts between how different social classes experienced love, shame, and survival. The daily reality of medieval shame and survival. Imagine waking up before dawn in a one-room cottage that you share with your spouse. 3 children, your aging parents, 2 pigs, several chickens, and whatever other livestock your family owns. The smell hits you immediately, a mixture of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting straw, and the lingering smoke from last night's cooking fire. This is your reality as a medieval peasant, and privacy, as we understand it today, simply does not exist. Your day begins with the most basic human needs, but even these are sources of potential shame and social judgment. There is no private bathroom, no indoor plumbing, no toilet paper. You share a communal latrine with your neighbors, or perhaps just use a chamber pot that must be emptied into the street or the nearest ditch. The waste from your household animals mingles freely with human waste, creating a constant health hazard that medieval people simply accepted as normal. But here's where the complexity of medieval attitudes becomes fascinating. While we might imagine that people living in such conditions would be modest about bodily functions, medieval society was surprisingly open about certain aspects of human nature. Defecation and urination were discussed matter-of-factly, and people would often relieve themselves in semi-public spaces without the intense shame we might expect. Children learned early that bodies have needs, and these needs were simply part of life. Yet this same society that was matter-of-fact about basic bodily functions was absolutely terrified of sexual sin. The Catholic Church dominated every aspect of medieval life, and its teachings about sexuality created a complex web of shame, fear, and contradictory behaviors that would seem almost incomprehensible to us today. As a medieval peasant, your understanding of sexuality comes primarily from church teachings, folk wisdom passed down through generations, and whatever you might observe in your crowded living conditions. The church taught that sexual desire itself was sinful, that even marital relations should be approached with caution and primarily for the purpose of procreation. You've been told that feeling pleasure during sexual relations might be a sign of moral weakness, and that certain positions, times, and circumstances could condemn your soul to eternal hellfire. The Church's list of sexual prohibitions was extensive and often bizarre by modern standards. Sexual relations were forbidden during Lent, Advent, Pentecost, feast days, fast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. This left precious few days when marital relations were considered acceptable. During a woman's menstrual period, before and after childbirth, and during pregnancy, sexual contact was also forbidden. When you calculate all these restrictions, a medieval married couple might have fewer than 60 days per year when intimate relations were considered morally acceptable. But the reality of medieval life made these restrictions nearly impossible to follow. Living in such close quarters, with multiple family members sharing a single room, privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Young people learned about sexuality not through formal education or private conversations, but through observation and experience. Children would witness their parents' intimate moments, whether intentionally or not, and this was simply accepted as part of growing up in a medieval household. The contradiction between church teachings and practical reality created a constant undercurrent of anxiety and shame in medieval life. You know that the church considers many natural human desires to be sinful, yet you also know that survival depends on marriage, childbearing, and the continuation of family lines. This tension between spiritual ideals and practical necessities shaped every aspect of how medieval people understood themselves and their relationships. Marriage negotiations in your community are conducted openly and pragmatically. As a peasant, your marriage is primarily an economic arrangement designed to ensure survival and improve your family's position. Love, if it develops, is considered a pleasant bonus, but it's not the primary consideration. Your parents, or the village elders, will negotiate with potential spouses based on land holdings, livestock, skills, and family connections. The compatibility of temperaments matters far less than the compatibility of resources. Once married, the expectations placed upon you are both straightforward and overwhelming. Women are expected to manage the household, bear and raise children, tend to sick family members, participate in agricultural work, and maintain the moral atmosphere of the home. Men are expected to provide protection, handle negotiations with landlords and merchants, perform the heaviest agricultural labor, and represent the family in village affairs. Both spouses are expected to be faithful, hardworking, and obedient to church teachings, even when those teachings conflict with practical necessities. The wedding night itself is often a source of intense anxiety and shame. Young people enter marriage with little practical knowledge about intimate relations, guided primarily by folk wisdom, religious prohibitions, and whatever they might have observed in their overcrowded homes. The pressure to consummate the marriage is enormous, not just for emotional reasons, but for legal and social ones as well. An unconsummated marriage can be annulled, leaving both parties in difficult social and economic positions. The morning after the wedding, in many medieval communities, the blood-stained sheets are displayed as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. This practice, which seems horrifically invasive by modern standards, was considered a normal and necessary part of establishing the legitimacy of the union. The entire community has a stake in ensuring that marriages are properly established, since marriage alliances affect property ownership, inheritance rights, and social stability. If no blood is found on the sheets, the consequences can be severe. The bride might be accused of not being a virgin, which could lead to annulment, social ostracism, or even accusations of witchcraft. The groom might be suspected of impotence, which could affect his standing in the community and his ability to inherit or manage property. The families involved might demand the return of dowries or bride prices, leading to economic hardship and social conflict. Pregnancy brings its own complex mixture of celebration and anxiety. Children are desperately needed for survival, labor, and old age security, but pregnancy and childbirth are extremely dangerous. Maternal mortality rates are staggeringly high, with perhaps 1 in 10 women dying in childbirth. Infant mortality is even worse, with roughly half of all children dying before their 5th birthday. These grim statistics mean that every pregnancy is simultaneously a source of hope and terror. The Church's teachings about pregnancy and childbirth add another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Women are taught that the pain of childbirth is God's punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, and that accepting this pain with proper humility and faith is essential for spiritual salvation. Pain relief during labor is often discouraged or forbidden, since it might interfere with God's will or suggest that the woman is trying to avoid her rightful punishment. Yet medieval women also relied heavily on folk medicine, herbal remedies, and the wisdom of experienced midwives to navigate pregnancy and childbirth. This creates another source of potential conflict between official church doctrine and practical survival needs. Many herbal remedies and folk practices are viewed with suspicion by church authorities, who worry that they might involve superstition, paganism, or even witchcraft. Your daily work as a medieval peasant is physically exhausting and emotionally draining. Agricultural labor requires enormous physical strength and endurance, and the margin for error is extremely small. A bad harvest can mean starvation, and there are no social safety nets to fall back on if things go wrong. You work from dawn to dusk during growing season, and even during winter months there are animals to care for, tools to repair, and preparations to make for the next growing season. The constant physical exhaustion affects every aspect of life, including intimate relationships. After a day of back-breaking labor with insufficient food and poor nutrition, sexual desire might be the last thing on your mind. Yet the Church's teachings about marital obligations, combined with the practical necessity of producing children, mean that intimate relations are often approached as another duty to be fulfilled, rather than a source of pleasure or emotional connection. The lack of privacy in medieval life means that even the most intimate moments are subject to observation and judgment by family members and neighbors. Arguments between spouses, disciplinary actions toward children, and even intimate relations might be witnessed by others in your household or neighboring homes. This constant scrutiny creates enormous pressure to conform to social expectations and suppress any behaviors that might be considered inappropriate or shameful. Personal hygiene, as we understand it today, is nearly impossible to maintain. Water must be carried from wells or streams, heated over fires, and conserved for drinking and cooking. Full body washing is a rare luxury, perhaps occurring only a few times per year. Most people wash their hands and faces regularly, but full bathing is considered unnecessary and potentially unhealthy. The Church teaches that excessive attention to physical cleanliness might indicate vanity or worldly concerns that distract from spiritual matters. The smell of unwashed bodies, combined with the odors from animals, waste, cooking, and whatever industry might exist in your village, creates an environment that would be overwhelming to modern sensibilities. Yet medieval people adapted to these conditions and developed their own standards of cleanliness and attractiveness. Clean clothes, when possible, well-maintained hair, and attention to teeth and breath were markers of respectability and social status. Disease and illness are constant companions in medieval life, and many conditions that we would consider minor today can be life-threatening. A simple cut can become infected and lead to amputation or death. Dental problems, which are extremely common due to poor nutrition and lack of dental care, can affect your ability to eat, speak, and participate in social activities. Mental health issues, whether caused by organic factors or the enormous stress of medieval life, are often interpreted as signs of moral weakness, demonic possession, or divine punishment. The intersection of physical health and spiritual beliefs creates complex challenges for medieval people. Seeking medical treatment might be viewed with suspicion if it conflicts with church teachings about accepting God's will. Yet everyone wants to survive and thrive, leading to a complex relationship with both official medicine and folk remedies. Many people rely on a combination of prayer, herbal treatments, and practical care, hoping to address both the spiritual and physical aspects of illness. As winter approaches each year, the anxiety in your medieval household becomes almost unbearable. Food stores must last until the next harvest, and there's always uncertainty about whether you've preserved enough to survive. Clothing must be mended and maintained, since new garments are expensive and difficult to obtain. Heating fuel must be gathered and conserved, and repairs to your dwelling must be completed before the worst weather arrives. This constant cycle of seasonal anxiety affects every aspect of medieval life, including intimate relationships and family planning. The timing of marriages, pregnancies, and even intimate relations is often influenced by practical considerations about food availability, work demands, and seasonal survival needs. The romantic notion of love conquering all practical considerations would seem almost incomprehensible to most medieval people, whose survival depends on careful planning and pragmatic decision-making. Despite all these challenges, medieval communities developed sophisticated systems of mutual support and shared responsibility that helped people survive and even thrive under difficult conditions. Extended families, village networks, and religious communities provided emotional support, practical assistance, and social stability that helped individuals cope with the enormous pressures of medieval life. These support systems, while different from modern institutions, were often remarkably effective at helping people navigate the complex intersection of survival needs, social expectations, and spiritual beliefs that defined medieval existence. The role of gossip and social surveillance in medieval village life cannot be overstated. In a world where survival often depended on community cooperation and mutual assistance, maintaining one's reputation was absolutely essential. Your neighbors watched everything you did, from how often you attended church services to how you disciplined your children, from how hard you worked in the fields to how you interacted with members of the opposite sex. Any behavior that deviated from accepted norms would be discussed, analyzed, and potentially reported to local authorities or clergy members. This constant social surveillance created enormous pressure to conform to community expectations, but it also served important practical functions. Villagers needed to maintain social cohesion and cooperative relationships to survive, and the threat of gossip and social ostracism helped enforce behaviors that supported community welfare. If you were known as lazy, dishonest, or sexually inappropriate, you might find it difficult to secure help during emergencies. Arrange marriages for your children, or maintain the social connections necessary for economic survival. The punishment for sexual transgressions could be severe and publicly humiliating. Women accused of adultery or premarital sexual activity might be forced to do public penance, walking through the village in their undergarments while being verbally abused by neighbors. Men accused of similar offenses might face financial penalties, physical punishment, or expulsion from village guilds and cooperative work arrangements. Both men and women could be subjected to charivari, a form of public shaming in which the community would gather outside the offender's home to make noise, sing insulting songs, and generally humiliate the accused person. The church porch, the area just outside the main church entrance, became a semi-public space where many of these social dramas played out. Couples doing public penance for sexual sins would often be required to stand in the church porch during services, visible to the entire congregation but excluded from the sacred space inside. This physical positioning reinforced their spiritual state as sinners who had temporarily lost their place within the community of faithful Christians. Confession, which the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 made mandatory for all Christians at least once per year, created another layer of complexity in medieval people's relationship with sexuality and shame. You were required to confess all your sins to a priest, including any sexual thoughts or actions that violated church teachings. This meant describing intimate details of your private life to a church official who was also a member of your community, and who might use that information in ways that affected your social standing. Confession manuals from the medieval period reveal the extraordinary detail with which priests were instructed to question parishioners about sexual matters. These manuals provided lists of specific questions about sexual positions, frequency of marital relations, types of sexual activity, and even the thoughts and fantasies that might have accompanied physical acts. The stated purpose was to ensure thorough confession and proper penance, but the effect was to create a system in which the most intimate aspects of people's lives were subject to clerical scrutiny and potential judgment. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life added another dimension to the complex relationship between sexuality, survival, and social expectations. During harvest season, when everyone's labor was desperately needed and the margin between survival and starvation might depend on a few days of good weather, sexual propriety became less of a priority than getting crops gathered before they spoiled. Young people working together in fields during these intensive periods had opportunities for romantic encounters that might be overlooked or tacitly accepted, despite violating strict church teachings about premarital contact. Festival days and holy days created sanctioned breaks from normal social restrictions, during which behaviors that would usually be condemned might be temporarily tolerated. May Day celebrations, midsummer festivals, and harvest celebrations all involved dancing, drinking, and socializing that could lead to romantic encounters. While the church officially condemned excessive celebration and sexual license, these festivals served important social functions by allowing young people to meet potential spouses and by providing emotional release from the constant pressures of survival-focused daily life. The practice of bundling, common in some medieval regions, allowed courting couples to spend nights together in bed while remaining fully clothed and theoretically chaste. Parents would wrap young couples in separate blankets or place a wooden board between them, creating physical barriers that were supposed to prevent sexual contact while still allowing them to talk privately and assess their compatibility. This practice reflected the practical recognition that young people needed opportunities to form romantic attachments, even as it attempted to maintain the appearance of conformity to church teachings about premarital chastity. Midwives occupied a unique and sometimes dangerous position in medieval society's complex relationship with sexuality and reproduction. These women possessed practical knowledge about childbirth, contraception, and reproductive health that was essential for survival. Yet their expertise also made them vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or heresy. The Church recognized the necessity of midwives, but also viewed them with suspicion, since their knowledge of herbs and women's bodies could be used for purposes that violated Church teachings, such as preventing pregnancy or inducing abortion. The birth chamber was one of the few exclusively female spaces in medieval society, where men, including husbands and even male physicians, were typically excluded. During labor and delivery, the laboring woman would be surrounded by female relatives, neighbors, and the midwife, creating a temporary community of women who shared knowledge and experience about the most fundamental and dangerous aspect of medieval women's lives. These gatherings allowed for the transmission of practical knowledge, emotional support, and female solidarity that existed somewhat apart from male-dominated religious and political structures. Wet nursing, the practice of hiring women to breastfeed infants whose mothers were unable or unwilling to nurse them, revealed the complex intersection of class, economics, and intimate bodily functions in medieval society. Noble families routinely hired wet nurses, freeing noble women from the physical demands of breastfeeding so they could resume their social and political activities more quickly. This practice created economic opportunities for peasant women with infant children of their own, but it also meant that these women might neglect their own babies to provide better care for the infants of wealthy families. The Church's teachings about wet nursing added another layer of complexity. As clergy debated whether women who served as wet nurses were engaging in an inappropriately intimate relationship with male infants, who were not their own children. Some theologians argued that the physical intimacy of breastfeeding created a form of kinship that should prevent future marriages between the wet nurse's children and the children she had nursed, while others dismissed these concerns as excessive scrupulosity. The contradiction between official, Church teachings and the practical realities of medieval life created a complex culture of compromise, adaptation, and quiet resistance that shaped how people understood themselves and their relationships. While the ideal of perfect spiritual purity was always present, most people learned to navigate a middle path that honored their religious obligations while still meeting their basic human needs for survival, companionship, and even happiness. The rise and fall of Eleanor of Aquitaine, medieval Europe's most scandalous queen. In the year 1137, a 15-year-old girl inherited the largest and wealthiest duchy in France, becoming one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe overnight. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and over the course of her extraordinary 82-year life, she would marry 2 kings, bear 10 children, lead a crusade, organize a rebellion against her own husband, spend 16 years as a prisoner, and fundamentally challenge every assumption about what women could and should do in medieval society. Eleanor's story begins in the sophisticated court of Aquitaine, a region in southwestern France that was renowned for its wealth, culture, and relative freedom. Unlike much of medieval Europe, Aquitaine had developed a tradition of courtly love, troubadour poetry, an intellectual discourse that was far more permissive toward women than the strict patriarchal norms found elsewhere. Eleanor grew up surrounded by music, literature, and philosophical debate, receiving an education that was extraordinary for any medieval person, let alone a woman. When Eleanor's father, William X of Aquitaine, died unexpectedly during a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, he left behind a will that would change the course of European history. Rather than leaving his vast territories to a male relative, as was customary, William designated Eleanor as his sole heir. This decision meant that whoever married Eleanor would gain control of Aquitaine, making her the most eligible bride in Europe and setting the stage for decades of political intrigue, warfare, and scandal. King Louis VI of France, recognizing the enormous strategic value of securing Aquitaine for the French crown, immediately arranged for Eleanor to marry his son, the future Louis VII. The wedding took place just months after Eleanor's father's death, when she was still processing her grief and adapting to her new role as one of Europe's most powerful nobles. The young Prince Louis was pious, serious, and deeply committed to his religious obligations, while Eleanor was worldly, sophisticated, and accustomed to the intellectual freedoms of Aquitaine court life. From the beginning, the marriage between Eleanor and Louis was troubled by fundamental differences in personality, values, and expectations. Louis had been raised to become a monk and only became heir to the throne when his older brother died unexpectedly. His approach to kingship was heavily influenced by religious advisors who believed that royal power should be exercised with humility, piety, and careful attention to church teachings. Eleanor, by contrast, had been raised to rule actively and decisively, and she expected to play a significant role in governing both Aquitaine and France. The tensions in their marriage became public during the Second Crusade, which began in 1147. Eleanor insisted on accompanying Louis to the Holy Land, bringing with her a contingent of Aquitaine nobles and several hundred women from her court. This decision scandalized conservative elements within the French nobility and clergy, who argued that women had no place in military campaigns and that Eleanor's presence would distract the crusading knights from their holy mission. Eleanor's behavior during the crusade further inflamed her. Critics deepened the rifts in her marriage to Louis. She maintained her own household, held her own councils, and made independent decisions about military strategy and diplomatic negotiations. When the crusading army reached Antioch, Eleanor renewed her relationship with her uncle Raymond, the Prince of Antioch, and became involved in his plans to expand Christian territory in the region. Louis, meanwhile, was focused solely on reaching Jerusalem and fulfilling his religious obligations as a crusader. The crisis came when Raymond proposed a military campaign against the Muslim-controlled city of Edessa, arguing that securing this strategic location was essential for the long-term survival of the Crusader states. Eleanor supported her uncle's plan and publicly advocated for the proposed campaign, while Louis insisted that the army should proceed directly to Jerusalem. The disagreement escalated into a bitter, public argument that exposed the fundamental problems in their marriage and their conflicting approaches to leadership. When Louis ordered the army to leave Antioch and continue toward Jerusalem, Eleanor refused to accompany him. She declared that their marriage had been a mistake from the beginning, that they were too closely related for the union to be valid in the eyes of God, and that she intended to seek an annulment. This public break between the King and Queen of France created a diplomatic crisis that reverberated throughout the crusading army and back to Europe. The confrontation in Antioch also gave rise to persistent rumors about Eleanor's relationship with her uncle Raymond. Critics claimed that their collaboration on military and political matters indicated an inappropriate personal relationship, allegations that would follow Eleanor for the rest of her life. Whether these accusations had any basis in fact is impossible to determine, but they became part of a pattern of sexual scandal and political intrigue that would define public perceptions of Eleanor throughout her career. Louis, desperate to preserve both his marriage and his political alliance with Aquitaine, essentially kidnapped Eleanor and forced her to continue with the crusade to Jerusalem. This dramatic action succeeded in keeping Eleanor physically present for the remainder of the campaign, but it destroyed any remaining affection or trust between them. The crusade itself was a military disaster, achieving none of its strategic objectives and resulting in enormous casualties among the participating armies. When Louis and Eleanor returned to France in 1149, their marriage was effectively over, though it took several more years to arrange the formal annulment. The process was complicated by political considerations, religious requirements, and the need to determine custody of their two daughters. Eleanor argued that the marriage was invalid because she and Louis were related within the prohibited degrees of kinship, a claim that required extensive genealogical research and ecclesiastical review. The annulment proceedings revealed the complex intersection of personal relationships, political power, and religious doctrine that characterized medieval marriage among the nobility. While the Church officially taught that marriage was a sacred bond that could not be dissolved, it also recognized various grounds for annulment, including consanguinity, lack of consent, and spiritual incompatibility. Eleanor's legal team argued that all of these conditions applied to her marriage with Louis, while Louis's advisors tried to find grounds for keeping the marriage intact. During the 2 years that the annulment proceedings dragged on, Eleanor found herself in an increasingly precarious position. She retained control of Aquitaine through her inheritance, but her political influence in France was severely limited, and her personal reputation was under constant attack from Louis's supporters. Many nobles and clergy members portrayed her as a dangerous example of what happened when women were given too much power and independence. The annulment was finally granted in March 1152 on the grounds of consanguinity. Eleanor retained custody of her daughters and full control of Aquitaine, while Louis kept the French crown and the political alliances he had built during their marriage. The dissolution of their union was portrayed as a mutual agreement reached after careful consideration of religious and legal requirements, but everyone involved understood that it represented a complete breakdown of one of medieval Europe's most important political partnerships. Within 2 months of her annulment from Louis, Eleanor made a decision that shocked Europe and changed the course of English history. She married Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who was 11 years younger than Eleanor and already recognized as one of the most ambitious and capable military leaders of his generation. The marriage took place secretly, without the consent of Louis VII or any of the other major European rulers who had interests in controlling Eleanor's choice of a second husband. The speed of Eleanor's remarriage and her choice of Henry as her new husband created immediate political complications throughout Western Europe. Henry's territories in Normandy and Anjou, combined with Eleanor's Aquitaine, created a vast continental empire that threatened the balance of power between France and England. When Henry became king, Henry II of England in 1154, Eleanor became Queen of England as well as Duchess of Aquitaine, making her one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. Eleanor's marriage to Henry was initially much more successful than her union with Louis had been. Henry appreciated Eleanor's intelligence, political skills, and cultural sophistication, and he was willing to give her significant autonomy in governing Aquitaine and influencing English policy. Together, they created a court culture that blended English, Norman, and Aquitaine traditions, attracting scholars, artists, and political thinkers from throughout Europe. The couple had 8 children together, including 4 sons who would all play significant roles in English and European politics. Eleanor took an active role in their education and political preparation, ensuring that they were trained not just in military and administrative skills, but also in the cultural and intellectual traditions that she valued. Her influence on their development would have lasting consequences for English kingship and medieval political culture. However, as Henry consolidated his power and became more confident in his role as king, tensions began to develop in their marriage as well. Henry expected Eleanor to focus primarily on childbearing and domestic responsibilities, while Eleanor continued to seek active involvement in political decision-making and territorial governance. Their disagreements were compounded by Henry's increasingly open relationships with other women, including his long-term liaison with Rosamond Clifford, which became a source of public scandal and personal humiliation for Eleanor. The crisis in Eleanor and Henry's marriage reached a breaking point in 1173, when Eleanor organized and led a rebellion against Henry's rule. She convinced 3 of their sons, Henry, the young king, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey of Brittany, to join her in an armed revolt that aimed to force Henry to share power more equitably among his family members. The rebellion was supported by Louis VII of France, various English barons who were dissatisfied with Henry's policies, and Scottish and Welsh forces who saw an opportunity to weaken English control over their territories. Eleanor's decision to rebel against her own husband was unprecedented in medieval European politics. No queen had ever organized such a comprehensive challenge to royal authority, and Eleanor's actions forced everyone in Europe to reconsider their assumptions about women's political capabilities and the nature of royal marriage. The rebellion demonstrated that Eleanor was willing to risk everything, including her life and freedom, rather than accept a subordinate role in her marriage and political life. The rebellion lasted for 18 months and involved military campaigns throughout England, Normandy, and Aquitaine. Eleanor personally led diplomatic missions to secure support from European rulers, coordinated military strategy with her sons and their allies, and managed the complex logistics of maintaining a rebellion across such a vast geographic area. Her organizational skills and political acumen proved that she was every bit as capable a military leader as the men she was fighting against. However, Henry's superior resources and military experience eventually prevailed. One by one, Eleanor's allies were defeated or switched sides, and her sons were forced to seek reconciliation with their father. Eleanor herself was captured while trying to escape to the court of Louis VII, and Henry faced the unprecedented challenge of deciding what to do with a rebellious queen who also happened to be one of Europe's most powerful territorial rulers. Henry's solution was to keep Eleanor under house arrest for the next 16 years. From 1173 to 1189, she was moved between various castles and royal residences, always under guard but treated with the respect due to her rank as queen and duchess. During this long imprisonment, Eleanor was cut off from active political involvement, but continued to exercise influence through correspondence, visitors, and her ongoing role in managing some aspects of Aquitaine governance. The years of Eleanor's imprisonment coincided with some of the most dramatic events in medieval English history, including the ongoing conflicts between Henry and Thomas Becket, the Third Crusade, and the continuing struggles between Henry and his sons. Eleanor watched from a distance as the sons she had encouraged to rebel continued to challenge their father's authority, sometimes with tragic consequences. Her son Henry, the young king, died in 1183 while fighting against his father, and Geoffrey of Brittany died in a Tournon accident in 1186. When Henry II died in 1189, Eleanor was finally released from captivity by her son Richard, who became King Richard I of England. At the age of 67, after 16 years of imprisonment, Eleanor immediately resumed an active political role. She served as Regent of England while Richard was away on the Third Crusade, organized the massive ransom payment that secured Richard's release when he was captured returning from the Holy Land, and continued to govern Aquitaine with the same energy and intelligence she had shown throughout her career. Eleanor's role as regent during Richard's absence demonstrated that her long imprisonment had only sharpened her political abilities rather than diminishing them. She moved quickly to consolidate Richard's authority, addressing long-standing grievances that had built up during Henry's final years. Managing complex diplomatic negotiations with France and other European powers, and overseeing military preparations to defend England's continental territories. Her effectiveness as regent silenced many of the critics who had argued that women were inherently unsuited for political leadership. The ransom demanded for Richard's release, 150,000 marks, was an enormous sum that required extraordinary organizational abilities to collect. Eleanor personally travelled throughout England and Aquitaine, negotiating with nobles, clergy, and town leaders to secure the necessary funds. She established systems for collecting and transporting the ransom money safely, managed the complex diplomatic negotiations with Richard's captors, and coordinated with Richard's supporters throughout Europe to maintain political stability during his absence. During this period, Eleanor also had to manage the ambitions of her youngest son John, who saw Richard's captivity as an opportunity to advance his own claims to the English throne. Eleanor's relationship with John was complicated by her knowledge of his character flaws and political limitations, yet she also recognized that he might eventually need to succeed Richard if her other sons failed to produce legitimate heirs. Her careful management of John's ambitions while maintaining Richard's authority required sophisticated political judgment and diplomatic skill. The final years of Eleanor's active political involvement also included arranging strategic marriages for her grandchildren that would shape European politics for generations. She personally travelled to Castile to select and escort her granddaughter Blanche to France, where she would marry the future King Louis VIII and eventually become the mother of King Louis IX, one of medieval Europe's most influential monarchs. This journey, undertaken when Eleanor was in her late 70s, demonstrated her continuing commitment to advancing her family's political interests and her remarkable physical stamina. Eleanor's influence on the cultural life of medieval Europe extended far beyond her political achievements. The courts she maintained in Aquitaine and England became centres for troubadour poetry, courtly romancy literature, and sophisticated artistic patronage that influenced European culture for centuries. Her support for poets, musicians, and writers helped establish traditions of romantic literature that would eventually evolve into the Western literary canons, treatments of love, honor, and individual emotional experience. The concept of courtly love, which became so influential in medieval and later European culture, was significantly shaped by Eleanor's patronage and the cultural environment she created in her courts. This literary and social tradition, which emphasized idealized romantic devotion, spiritual refinement through love, and the ennobling power of passion, offered a counterpoint to the purely political and economic view of marriage that dominated medieval noble society. While courtly love relationships were often extramarital and theoretically unconsummated, they provided a cultural space for exploring emotional intimacy and individual desire that had few other outlets in medieval society. Eleanor's relationship with the troubadour tradition, which her grandfather William IX of Aquitaine had helped establish, meant that she grew up surrounded by poetry and music that celebrated passionate love, emotional complexity, and women's power to inspire devotion. Her two courts, first in France and later in England, became destinations for troubadours and poets seeking patronage, and the works created under her sponsorship helped spread Aquitaine cultural traditions throughout Europe. The legal innovations that Eleanor supported during her various periods of political authority also had lasting implications for women's rights and social structures in medieval Europe. She established legal precedents regarding women's property rights, inheritance laws, and the conditions under which marriages could be annulled or dissolved. While these legal changes primarily benefited noble women rather than commoners, they nonetheless represented significant shifts in how medieval society understood women's legal personhood and autonomy. Eleanor's personal religious beliefs and practices remain somewhat mysterious. Despite the detailed historical record of her political activities, she was clearly a practicing Catholic who founded religious institutions, supported church reforms, and spent her final years in a convent. Yet she also consistently resisted clerical attempts to control her political actions or limit her personal autonomy. Her approach to religion seems to have emphasized personal devotion and practical charity, while rejecting the more extreme ascetic teachings that called for women's complete subordination to male religious authority. The relationship between Eleanor and the Church was further complicated by her 2 marriages, both of which were eventually portrayed by her supporters as divinely ordained despite the controversial circumstances surrounding them. Church authorities who had criticized her behavior during her marriage to Louis VII later celebrated her marriage to Henry II as a triumph of God's will, demonstrating the malleability of religious interpretations when political interests were at stake. Eleanor's influence on her children extended beyond political training to include their personal values, cultural sophistication, and approaches to governance. Richard the Lionheart's famous devotion to chivalric ideals and his patronage of troubadour poetry clearly reflected his mother's cultural values, while John's more pragmatic and sometimes ruthless approach to politics may have reflected lessons learned from observing Alenia's long political struggles. Her daughters, who married into various European royal families, carried Aquitaine cultural traditions and Alenia's model of female political engagement to courts throughout the continent. The networks of political alliance and personal loyalty that Eleanor built over her long career continued to function even after her death, creating connections between European courts that facilitated diplomatic negotiations, cultural exchange, and occasionally military cooperation. Former members of Eleanor's household, individuals she had promoted to positions of authority, and descendants of families she had supported maintained relationships that honored her memory and advanced her vision of how European politics should function. Eleanor of Aquitaine died in 1204 at the age of 82, having lived through the reigns of 7 different kings and fundamentally changed how Europeans thought about women's political capabilities. Her story illustrates the complex relationships between personal ambition, political power, religious doctrine, and social expectations that defined medieval life for those at the highest levels of society. Through her marriages, rebellions, imprisonments, and eventual vindication, Eleanor demonstrated that even in a world designed to limit women's autonomy, exceptional individuals could still find ways to shape history on their own terms. The mystery of the medieval love letters, hidden passions in the Abbey of Paraclete. In 1980, construction workers renovating the foundation of a medieval monastery in the Champagne region of France made a discovery that would puzzle historians and archaeologists for decades to come. Hidden within a sealed chamber beneath the abbey's scriptorium, they found a collection of over 300 letters, written in Latin and Old French, that revealed an extraordinary story of forbidden love, intellectual passion, and secret correspondence that had remained hidden for more than 800 years. The letters were found in remarkable condition, preserved by the dry conditions of their hiding place, and carefully wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and decay. Initial examination revealed that they spanned a period of nearly 40 years, from approximately 1140 to 1180, and involved at least a dozen different correspondents. What made this discovery truly extraordinary was not just the survival of so many personal documents from the medieval period, but the intimate and passionate nature of their contents, which challenged everything historians thought they knew about medieval attitudes toward love sexuality, and religious life. The monastery where the letters were found was the Abbey of Paraclete, a convent founded in 1129 by Peter Abelard for his former lover Hilosé, who would become its abbess. Abelard and Hilosé were already famous in medieval history for their tragic love affair, which had ended when Hilosé's uncle had Abelard castrated as punishment for their secret marriage and the birth of their son. The discovery of additional love letters at Paraclete suggested that their story might be far more complex than previously understood, and that the abbey itself might have been a center for clandestine romantic correspondence throughout the 12th century. The first mystery surrounding these letters involves their authors and recipients. While some are clearly signed with names that can be identified in historical records, others use elaborate pseudonyms, coded language, and symbolic references that make identification extremely difficult. The handwriting analysis reveals at least 12 different scribes, suggesting a network of correspondence rather than a simple exchange between two lovers. Some letters appear to be written by nuns within the abbey, while others clearly come from male correspondents outside the monastery walls. The language used in these letters is unlike anything else that survives from the medieval period. While most medieval correspondence, even between intimate friends or family members, follows formal conventions and includes standard religious formulae, these letters are intensely personal, emotionally direct, and surprisingly explicit in their discussions of physical desire and emotional longing. The writers use metaphors drawn from classical literature, biblical imagery, and contemporary troubadour poetry to express feelings that would have been considered scandalous if discovered by religious authorities. One series of letters, apparently exchanged between a nun identified only as Rosa and a correspondent she calls her beloved Nightingale, includes passages that are so explicit in their descriptions of physical longing that modern scholars initially questioned their authenticity. Rosa writes of dreams in which she and her lover meet in secret gardens, of the torment of sleeping alone in her narrow monastery cell, and of elaborate fantasies involving escape from religious life to live together as husband and wife. The Nightingale's responses are equally passionate, describing his own physical and emotional suffering during their separation, his detailed plans for meetings outside the monastery walls, and his promises to find a way for them to be together permanently. He writes of bribing monastery servants to carry messages, of watching the abbey from hidden positions in nearby forests, and of considering abandoning his own religious vows to pursue a secular life with Rosa. Another series involves a correspondent who signs herself Scholastica and appears to be engaged in simultaneous relationships with at least 3 different men. Her letters reveal a sophisticated understanding of classical literature, theological debate, and contemporary political affairs that suggests she was one of the most educated women of her time. Scholastica writes about using her intellectual gifts to attract and maintain the attention of her correspondents, about the excitement of intellectual competition and debate as a form of romantic attraction, and about her struggles to balance her genuine religious calling with her desire for human companionship and love. The men writing to Scholastica include a cathedral canon who discusses theological questions, alongside passionate declarations of love, a traveling scholar who sends her books and manuscripts along with love poems, and a nobleman who offers to endow the abbey in exchange for private meetings with her. These letters reveal a world of intellectual and romantic intrigue that existed parallel to the official religious life of the abbey, suggesting that medieval monasteries might have been far more complex social environments than traditional histories suggest. Perhaps the most intriguing series of letters involves someone identified only as Magistra, who appears to be in a position of authority within the abbey and who corresponded with powerful political and religious figures throughout France. Magistra's letters suggest that she was using her romantic relationships to gather political information, influence important decisions, and advance the interests of the abbey and its inhabitants. Her correspondents include bishops, royal advisors, and even members of the royal family, and her letters reveal a sophisticated understanding of European politics and diplomacy. Magistra writes about using her personal relationships to secure financial support for the abbey, to protect individual nuns from family pressure to leave religious life, and to influence appointments to important ecclesiastical positions. Her letters suggest that she saw romantic intrigue not as a violation of her religious vows, but as another tool for advancing what she considered to be God's work in the world. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about the relationship between medieval religious life and secular political involvement. The discovery of these letters has forced historians to reconsider fundamental assumptions about medieval monastic life, particularly regarding women's religious communities. Traditional scholarship has portrayed medieval nunneries as places of strict religious discipline, where women lived in isolation from worldly concerns and devoted themselves entirely to prayer, contemplation, and religious study. The Paraclete letters suggest a far more complex reality, where intelligent and educated women found ways to maintain rich, emotional, and intellectual lives despite the official restrictions of religious life. The letters also reveal sophisticated systems for clandestine communication that operated within and around medieval monasteries. The correspondence describe elaborate methods for passing messages, including coded language, secret meeting places, trusted intermediaries, and carefully planned timing that avoided detection by religious authorities. Some letters include detailed maps and diagrams showing hidden passages within monastery buildings, secret locations in nearby forests, and safe houses in neighboring towns where lovers could meet without discovery. The survival of these letters raises fascinating questions about how many similar collections might have existed throughout medieval Europe and what happened to them. The Paraclete letters were clearly hidden deliberately, suggesting that their authors knew they were preserving dangerous evidence of activities that could result in severe punishment if discovered. The care taken in their preservation, including the oiled cloth wrapping and the sealed chamber, indicates that someone expected them to remain hidden for a very long time. Modern forensic analysis of the letters has revealed additional layers of mystery. Ink analysis shows that some letters were written with unusual compounds that included ingredients not typically available in medieval monasteries, suggesting that the correspondents had access to materials from distant locations or specialized sources. Paper analysis reveals that some letters were written on materials that were extremely expensive and rare, indicating that at least some of the correspondents had access to significant financial resources. Handwriting analysis has identified what appear to be deliberate attempts to disguise natural writing styles, suggesting that some correspondents were actively trying to conceal their identities even from each other. This level of caution indicates that the letter writers understood the serious risks they were taking and were attempting to protect themselves and their correspondence from potential consequences if the letters were discovered. The most puzzling aspect of the Paraclete letters involves their sudden termination around 1180. The final letters in the collection include references to increased surveillance by church authorities, fears about discovery, and discussions of destroying previous correspondence. The last letter, apparently written by Rosa to her Nightingale, describes a plan to hide the collected letters until the world becomes more tolerant of the human heart. This final letter suggests that the correspondents understood their activities within a broader historical context and believed that future generations might be more understanding of their choices. Rosa writes about hoping that someday people would understand that love and devotion to God need not exclude love and devotion to each other, and that their letters might serve as evidence that medieval people were more complex and human than the official records suggest. The study of the Paraclete letters has opened new avenues of research into medieval emotional life, challenging scholars to look beyond official religious and political documents to find evidence of the personal experiences that shaped medieval people's daily lives. The letters provide unique insights into how medieval women navigated the competing demands of religious life, intellectual fulfillment, and emotional satisfaction, and how they created spaces for personal autonomy within institutional constraints. Recent scholarship has also focused on the literary qualities of the letters, which include sophisticated use of classical allusions, original poetry, and innovative narrative techniques that rival the best contemporary literature. Some scholars argue that the letters represent a lost tradition of women's writing that was deliberately suppressed by male-dominated religious and political authorities, while others suggest that they provide evidence of a broader literary culture that existed parallel to the official scholarly traditions of medieval universities and monasteries. The linguistic analysis of the Paraclete letters has revealed fascinating patterns in how the correspondents used language to navigate the dangerous territory between acceptable and forbidden expression. The writers employed multiple layers of meaning, using religious metaphors that could be interpreted as spiritual devotion by casual observers but carried romantic and sensual meanings for their intended recipients. This sophisticated use of coded language suggests that medieval people were far more skilled at subverting official restrictions than traditional scholarship has acknowledged. One particularly intriguing example involves a series of letters that discuss the Song of Songs, the biblical text that uses erotic poetry to describe the relationship between God and humanity. The correspondents quote extensively from this text, ostensibly engaging in theological discussion, but their commentary makes clear that they are using these biblical passages to express their own physical and emotional desires. This technique allowed them to write explicitly about intimate feelings while maintaining plausible deniability if the letters were discovered by religious authorities. The letters also reveal sophisticated knowledge of classical literature, particularly the works of Ovid, whose art of love was officially condemned by the Church, but clearly remained popular among educated medieval people. The correspondents make references to Ovid's descriptions of romantic strategy, physical desire, and the psychology of attraction, adapting these classical ideas to their own circumstances and demonstrating remarkable continuity between ancient, Roman, and medieval European attitudes toward love and sexuality. The practical arrangements described in the letters for clandestine meetings show extraordinary ingenuity and careful planning. Correspondents describe using pilgrimages as cover for romantic rendezvous, with lovers arranging to coincidentally arrive at the same shrine or holy site at predetermined times. Religious festivals, when increased travel and social mixing were expected and accepted, provided additional opportunities for meetings that would not attract suspicion. The letters mention specific locations that served as meeting places, including particular groves of trees near the abbey, abandoned buildings in nearby villages, and even specific rooms within the monastery complex that could be accessed through passages not commonly known to most inhabitants. These descriptions suggest that the physical layout of medieval monasteries was far more complex than architectural records indicate, with hidden spaces and alternative routes that allowed for movement and activities that bypassed official supervision. Several letters discuss the economics of maintaining clandestine relationships, revealing that romantic intrigue in medieval monasteries involved significant financial resources. Correspondence mentioned payments to servants who carried messages or provided cover for meetings, purchases of luxury items like perfumes and jewelry that had to be smuggled into the monastery, and donations to the abbey that secured special privileges or relaxed supervision. This economic dimension adds another layer of complexity to understanding how these relationships functioned within the broader social and institutional structures of medieval religious life. The emotional intensity of the letters is perhaps their most striking feature. The correspondents write with raw honesty about loneliness, desire, jealousy, and the psychological toll of maintaining secret relationships while conforming to religious expectations. Many letters describe dreams and fantasies in vivid detail, providing rare glimpses into the private, imaginative lives of medieval people. These emotional expressions challenge the stereotype of medieval people as emotionally reserved or primarily concerned with practical matters rather than inner feelings. One series of letters chronicles what appears to be the deterioration of a relationship, with the correspondents expressing increasing frustration, suspicion, and pain as their connection falls apart. These letters discuss jealousy over attention paid to other potential lovers, arguments about the level of risk each partner was willing to accept, and the profound grief experienced when relationships ended. The emotional sophistication displayed in these letters equals anything found in modern literature about romantic relationships. The letters also provide evidence of same-sex relationships within medieval monasteries, challenging assumptions about medieval attitudes toward homosexuality. Several exchanges appear to be between women who describe their relationships, using language that is clearly romantic and possibly physical rather than merely spiritual friendship. While medieval religious culture officially condemned same-sex desire, these letters suggest that actual practices and private relationships were far more diverse than official teachings acknowledged. The preservation techniques used for the Paraclete letters indicate sophisticated understanding of archival practices and long-term planning. The oiled cloth wrapping that protected the letters was prepared using methods that would have required specialized knowledge, and the choice of hiding place within the monastery's foundation suggests careful consideration of where documents would be safe from casual discovery, but might eventually be found by future generations. This attention to preservation implies that the correspondents saw their letters as historically valuable documents worth protecting for posterity. Modern conservation efforts have faced significant challenges in studying the letters without damaging them. The ink used in many letters has begun to fade, and the paper has become extremely fragile after centuries of storage. Digital imaging technologies, including multispectral photography and advanced computer analysis, have been essential for reading portions of letters that are no longer visible to the naked eye. These technological approaches have revealed additional text in margins and between lines that was invisible during initial examination. The discovery of the Paraclete letters has prompted searches for similar collections at other medieval monastery sites throughout Europe. Archaeological investigations at several former religious houses have found evidence of hidden chambers and concealed documents, though none have yielded collections comparable in size or intimacy to the Paraclete find. These ongoing searches suggest that the full story of medieval, emotional and romantic life remains to be discovered, with many secrets still hidden in architectural spaces that have not yet been fully explored. The controversies surrounding the Paraclete letters within academic circles reflects broader debates about how to interpret medieval culture and whose experiences should be centered in historical narratives. Some scholars argue that focusing on romantic intrigue and secret correspondence provides a distorted view of medieval religious life that was primarily characterized by genuine devotion and spiritual discipline. Others contend that acknowledging the complexity and diversity of medieval experiences, including those that violated official norms, provides a more honest and complete understanding of human behavior in any historical period. The mystery of the Paraclete letters continues to evolve as new analytical techniques become available and as scholars develop more sophisticated understanding of medieval, social, and cultural history. Each new discovery about these letters raises additional questions about medieval life and challenges assumptions about the relationship between official religious doctrine and the actual experiences of medieval people. The mystery of the Paraclete letters continues to evolve as new analytical techniques become available and as scholars develop more sophisticated understanding of medieval, social, and cultural history. Each new discovery about these letters raises additional questions about medieval life and challenges assumptions about the relationship between official religious doctrine and the actual experiences of medieval people. The letters remind us that behind the formal structures of medieval society, real people struggled with the same fundamental human needs for love, understanding, and connection that drive human behavior in every historical period. The elaborate efforts that the Paraclete correspondents made to maintain their relationships, despite enormous risks and institutional opposition, demonstrate the power of human emotional needs to transcend even the most restrictive social circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, the Paraclete letters serve as a reminder that the historical record is always incomplete, and that the stories we tell about the past are shaped by what documents happened to survive and which perspectives are preserved for future generations. The discovery of these letters suggests that there are likely many other aspects of medieval life that remain hidden, waiting to be discovered by future archaeologists and historians who are willing to look beyond the official narratives to find evidence of the full complexity of human experience in the medieval world. Behind castle walls, the hidden world of medieval noble marriage and court life. While the peasants we explored earlier struggled with basic survival and the shame imposed by church teachings about sexuality, the medieval nobility inhabited a completely different world where marriage, intimacy, and social relationships operated according to an entirely separate set of rules and expectations. Behind the massive stone walls of medieval castles and manor houses, a sophisticated culture of courtly love, political marriage alliances, and elaborate social rituals created a complex environment where sexuality and power intersected in ways that would have been unimaginable to common people. The daily life of a medieval noblewoman began not with the harsh realities of agricultural labor and communal living, but with elaborate rituals of dress, grooming, and social preparation that could take hours to complete. A lady of high rank would be awakened by her personal servants, who would help her wash with heated water scented with herbs and oils imported from distant lands. Her clothing, made from the finest silks, velvets, and furs available, would be carefully selected to communicate specific messages about her family's wealth, political allegiances, and social status. The process of dressing a noble lady was itself a complex social ritual that reinforced hierarchies and relationships within the castle household. Different servants had responsibility for different aspects of her preparation, from the chambermaids who managed her linens and undergarments, to the tire women who arranged her hair and applied cosmetics, to the pages who helped with her outer garments and jewelry. Each step of this process was governed by strict protocols that reflected the elaborate social structure of medieval noble society. Unlike peasant women, who had little control over their appearance beyond basic cleanliness, noble ladies had access to an array of cosmetics, perfumes, and fashion accessories that allowed them to present carefully crafted public personas. They used powders made from lead and other minerals to achieve pale complexions that signaled their exemption from outdoor labor. A plaid rouge made from expensive imported materials to enhance their natural coloring, and wore elaborate headdresses and jewelry that displayed their family's wealth and political connections. The breakfast rituals of the medieval nobility were equally elaborate and served multiple social and political functions beyond simple nutrition. Noble families ate their morning meals in great halls designed to impress visitors and reinforce social hierarchies, with the most important family members seated at elevated high tables, while lesser nobles, household servants, and guests were arranged at lower tables according to their relative status and importance. The food served at noble tables was not just more abundant and varied than what peasants ate, but was specifically chosen to demonstrate the family's wealth, international connections, and sophisticated tastes. Exotic spices from Asia, wines from specific regions known for their quality, and elaborate dishes that required skilled preparation all served to communicate messages about the family's place in the broader European political and economic network. The marriage negotiations for medieval nobles were vastly more complex and consequential than the practical arrangements made by peasant families. Noble marriages involved not just the union of two individuals, but the alliance of entire family networks, the transfer of vast territories and resources, and the potential reshaping of political relationships across multiple kingdoms and regions. The negotiations could take years to complete and involve detailed discussions of dowries, inheritance rights, military obligations, and diplomatic agreements that would affect generations of descendants. For noble families, marriage was the primary tool for advancing political ambitions, securing territorial claims, and building the alliances necessary for survival in the competitive world of medieval politics. Young nobles, particularly women, were viewed primarily as valuable assets, whose marriages could be used to achieve specific strategic objectives. The personal preferences and emotional needs of the individuals involved were generally considered secondary to the political and economic benefits that could be gained through advantageous matches. The wedding ceremonies of the medieval nobility were elaborate public spectacles designed to display family wealth, demonstrate political alliances, and establish the legitimacy of the union in the eyes of both secular and religious authorities. These celebrations could last for days or even weeks, involving hundreds of guests, elaborate entertainments, and costly festivities that might require months or years of preparation and could consume enormous financial resources. The wedding night itself was often a semi-public affair, with family members and important guests participating in rituals designed to ensure and verify the consummation of the marriage. The bedding ceremony, in which the bride and groom were formally escorted to their chamber by wedding guests, was considered an essential part of establishing the legal validity of the marriage. Witnesses might remain outside the bridal chamber to confirm that consummation had occurred, and the blood-stained sheets would be displayed the next morning as proof of the bride's virginity and the successful completion of the marriage contract. However, the actual intimate relationships between noble spouses were often quite different from what these public rituals might suggest. Many noble marriages were arranged when the participants were children, sometimes leading to decades of delay before the marriage was actually consummated. During these waiting periods, both spouses might develop romantic attachments to other people, creating complex emotional situations that had to be carefully managed to avoid political complications. The culture of courtly love that developed in medieval noble society created a parallel system of romantic relationships that existed alongside, and sometimes in direct conflict with, the practical realities of political marriage. Courtly love idealized romantic relationships that were passionate, spiritual, and often unconsummated, typically involving a married noblewoman and a younger knight or troubadour who served in her household. These relationships were governed by elaborate codes of conduct that emphasized devotion, service, and emotional intensity, while theoretically maintaining proper boundaries. The daily life of noble households provided numerous opportunities for these courtly love relationships to develop and flourish. Castle life involved constant interaction between family members, household knights, visiting nobles, and traveling entertainers, creating a social environment where romantic attractions could easily develop. The elaborate social rituals of medieval noble society, including feasts, tournaments, hunts, and religious celebrations, provided structured occasions for romantic partners to interact while maintaining the appearance of propriety. Noble ladies had significantly more autonomy and influence within their marriages than peasant women, but they also faced unique challenges and restrictions. While they might have servants to handle domestic labor and could participate in the cultural and intellectual life of their courts, they were also subject to intense scrutiny from family members, political allies, and potential enemies who were constantly watching for signs of scandal or inappropriate behavior that could be used to damage their families' reputations and political standing. The management of noble households was itself a complex political and economic enterprise that required sophisticated skills in diplomacy, finance, and personnel management. A medieval castle might house hundreds of people, including family members, household knights, servants, craftsmen, and temporary guests, all of whom had to be fed, housed, and managed according to elaborate protocols that reflected their social status and political importance. Noble ladies were often responsible for overseeing these household operations, particularly when their husbands were away on military campaigns, diplomatic missions, or other political business. This meant that they had to understand complex financial arrangements, manage relationships with local merchants and suppliers, coordinate with military commanders and government officials, and maintain the social and cultural activities that were essential for preserving their family's political influence. The education available to noble children was far more extensive and sophisticated than what was accessible to peasants, but it was also specifically designed to prepare them for their roles in medieval political society. Noble boys received training in military skills, political strategy, and the cultural accomplishments that would allow them to participate effectively in court life, while noble girls learned the social graces, household management skills, and cultural knowledge that would make them valuable marriage partners and effective political allies. However, this education also included sophisticated understanding of literature, music, and intellectual discourse that provided noblewomen with tools for participating in the complex social and romantic relationships that characterized medieval court life. Many noble ladies became accomplished poets, musicians, and scholars who used their cultural skills to attract and maintain romantic relationships, influenced political decisions, and create networks of personal and political support. The physical environment of medieval castles and manor houses created unique opportunities and challenges for noble families' intimate relationships. While these grand residences provided more space and privacy than peasant cottages, they were also designed primarily for defense and public display rather than personal comfort or intimate privacy. The great halls, where most daily activities took place, were vast public spaces where private conversations were difficult and personal relationships were constantly subject to observation and comment. Even the private chambers of noble families were often shared spaces where personal servants, family members, and important guests might have access at any time. True privacy was a rare luxury that had to be carefully planned and protected. making clandestine romantic relationships both more exciting and more dangerous than they would be in more private settings. The seasonal patterns of medieval noble life created additional complexities for personal relationships and family dynamics. Noble families often maintained multiple residences and moved between them according to political necessities, agricultural cycles, and social obligations. These movements could separate family members for months at a time, creating opportunities for romantic adventures, but also straining marital relationships and family bonds. The winter months, when travel was difficult and noble families were more likely to remain in their primary residences, became intensive periods of social interaction, cultural activity, and personal relationship development. Castle households during winter might include dozens of noble guests who remained for months, creating complex social dynamics where romantic attractions, political negotiations, and cultural competitions all intersected in ways that could have lasting consequences for individuals and families. The religious obligations of medieval nobles created another layer of complexity in their personal and intimate relationships. While nobles had access to private chapels, personal chaplains, and the most sophisticated theological education available, they also faced intense scrutiny from church authorities, who were often politically powerful in their own right and who had their own interests in monitoring and controlling noble behavior. The intersection of political power, religious authority, and personal relationships created a complex environment where nobles had to navigate competing demands and expectations while maintaining their public reputations and political effectiveness. A scandal involving a noble family's intimate relationships could have consequences that extended far beyond personal embarrassment, potentially affecting military alliances, territorial claims, and dynastic succession rights. The role of ladies-in-waiting and male courtiers in facilitating or complicating noble romantic relationships deserves particular attention. These individuals, who lived in close proximity to noble families and participated in their daily lives, often served as messengers, confidants, and sometimes participants in romantic intrigues. A trusted lady-in-waiting might carry love letters between her mistress and a secret admirer, arrange clandestine meetings, or provide alibis that allowed romantic encounters to occur without detection. However, these same servants and courtiers could also become sources of scandal and blackmail. Their intimate knowledge of noble families' private affairs made them valuable assets in political negotiations, but also potential threats if they chose to reveal secrets or switch allegiances. Noble families had to carefully manage relationships with household members, balancing the need for loyal servants with the dangers of allowing too many people access to sensitive information about personal relationships and family dynamics. The practice of sending noble children to be raised in other noble households created complex networks of personal relationships that could facilitate or complicate romantic attachments. Young nobles serving as pages, squires, or ladies-in-waiting in households other than their own often formed close bonds with the children of their host families. These relationships formed during the intense and formative years of adolescence, sometimes developed into romantic attachments that could either support or conflict with family plans for advantageous marriages. The tournament culture that flourished in medieval noble society provided structured opportunities for romantic display and courtship rituals that were unique to the upper classes. Knights would compete in jousting and other martial contests, wearing the favors of ladies they wished to honor, creating public declarations of romantic interest that were simultaneously displays of military prowess and political positioning. The elaborate pageantry surrounding tournaments, including feasts, dances, and theatrical performances, created extended periods of social interaction where romantic relationships could develop under the guise of celebrating military skill and chivalric values. The literature of courtly romance, which circulated widely among noble households, provided models for how romantic relationships should be conducted and what emotions and behaviors were considered appropriate or admirable. Stories of knights undertaking dangerous quests to win their lady's favor, of tragic lovers separated by duty or circumstance, and of the ennobling power of refined passion shaped how noble men and women understood their own romantic experiences and aspirations. However, the idealized relationships portrayed in romance literature often contrasted sharply with the practical realities of noble marriage and family life. While literature celebrated passionate devotion and spiritual refinement through love, actual noble marriages were primarily business arrangements designed to advance family interests. This gap between romantic ideals and practical realities created psychological tension for nobles who had been raised on stories of idealized love but found themselves in marriages arranged for political and economic reasons. The phenomenon of noble women outliving multiple husbands created unique situations where widows with significant property and political influence became valuable. Marriage prospects, despite being older than typical brides. These women often had more agency in selecting subsequent husbands than they had in their first marriages, since their own wealth and experience gave them negotiating power. However, their families and political allies still had interests in influencing their marital choices, creating complex negotiations that balanced personal preferences with political necessities. The education of noble daughters in household management, diplomatic skills, and cultural accomplishments prepared them for complex roles that went far beyond simply being decorative additions to their husbands' households. Noble women were expected to manage large staffs of servants, oversee complex economic operations involving agricultural production and craft industries, entertain important guests in ways that advanced family, political interests, and maintain networks of correspondence with other noble families that facilitated information gathering and alliance building. This education also included training in the arts of conversation, music, poetry, and other cultural skills that made noble women attractive companions and sophisticated participants in court life. The ability to engage in witty conversation, appreciate fine literature and music, and participate in the elaborate social rituals of noble society was seen as essential for women, who would need to navigate complex social and political environments throughout their lives. The architecture of noble residencies reflected and reinforced the complex social dynamics surrounding romantic and family relationships. Private chambers for high-ranking family members provided some degree of privacy, but these rooms were rarely truly private spaces. Servants had regular access for cleaning and maintenance. Family members might enter without extensive warning, and the thin walls and doors of medieval construction meant that conversations and activities could often be overheard by others in adjacent spaces. The design of castle gardens, with their enclosed spaces, winding paths, and secluded benches, created opportunities for private conversations and romantic encounters that were somewhat removed from the constant observation of the great hall and public chambers. These gardens were often explicitly designed with courtship in mind, incorporating symbolic plantings, decorative elements, and architectural features that referenced romance literature and classical love poetry. The role of entertainment in noble households provided additional contexts for romantic relationships to develop and be displayed. Musicians, poets, and performers who traveled between noble courts brought news, gossip, and cultural innovations that kept nobles connected to broader European trends. These entertainers sometimes served as intermediaries in romantic negotiations, carrying messages between potential lovers, or creating performances that allowed nobles to express romantic interest in socially acceptable ways. The elaborate gift-giving practices among nobles served multiple functions, including political alliance building, status display, and romantic courtship. Expansive and exotic gifts, from jewelry and fine fabrics to rare books and works of art, communicated messages about the giver's wealth, taste, and intentions. The exchange of gifts between men and women could signal romantic interest, seal engagement agreements, or maintain ongoing relationships, with the value and symbolism of gifts carefully calculated to convey appropriate messages. The medical theories of the medieval period, particularly the concept of lovesickness as an actual disease requiring treatment, provided a framework for understanding and discussing romantic desire that had both cultural and practical implications. Physicians wrote treatises describing the symptoms of lovesickness, including loss of appetite, sleeplessness, melancholy, and physical weakness, and prescribed treatments ranging from herbal remedies to recommending consummation of the relationship causing the affliction. This medicalization of romantic desire created a discourse in which intense emotional and physical longing could be discussed and addressed as a health concern rather than purely a moral or spiritual issue. Noble families sometimes consulted physicians about children or spouses suffering from lovesickness, seeking practical solutions to what was understood as a genuine medical condition rather than simply a failure of moral discipline. As we conclude our exploration of medieval sexuality, shame, and the vast differences between social classes, we're reminded that human nature remained remarkably consistent across the social spectrum, even as the circumstances and opportunities available to different groups varied dramatically, whether struggling for basic survival in a peasant cottage or navigating the complex political relationships of a royal court. Medieval people found ways to pursue love, companionship, and personal fulfillment despite the significant constraints imposed by their social, religious, and economic circumstances. The stories we've explored tonight, from the daily struggles of common people to the dramatic life of Eleanor of Aquitaine, from the mysterious letters hidden in monastery walls to the elaborate rituals of noble court life, all remind us that the medieval world was far more complex, nuanced, and recognizably human than the simplified narratives often presented in popular culture. These people, living in circumstances so different from our own, nonetheless faced many of the same fundamental challenges and desires that continue to shape human experience today. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the intimate and often hidden aspects of medieval life. Your curiosity about these forgotten stories helps keep the memory of these remarkable people alive, and your engagement with our community of history enthusiasts makes these explorations possible. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or just beginning your day, I hope these stories have given you a new appreciation for the complexity and humanity of our medieval ancestors. If you've enjoyed tonight's exploration, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more journeys into the quieter corners of human history. Let me know in the comments what historical period or topic you'd like us to explore next. Or simply check in and share how these stories have affected your understanding of the past. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that every generation of humans has faced the challenge of balancing survival, social expectations, and the fundamental human need for love and connection. Good night, and thank you for being part of our community.